my talk for today is just looking at how we approach adaptive management. So looking at it from a partnership, stewardship, and custodianship perspective, and where Sandbox has come from and the direction we're going in. As I mentioned with the Vision 2040 that was already revealed, this will set the scene a little bit more for the direction we're headed into. Next, please. So first things first, whenever we want to head in a certain direction, we always have to define exactly what it is that, well, exactly. We want to define where we are headed. We want to know what is the desired state. But that does not necessarily mean it has to be a physical state. It can be a state of being, a state of systems working together, but something that we're visioning towards. And how we do that then is taken to the next step of how do we actually monitor, evaluate, and just keep checks and balances on the direction that we're headed in. And that's the area where most of us here are generally embedded, is that section in the middle of actually the monitoring and researching and just finding out and keeping track of where it is that we are. And then from there, moving on to the outcomes so that we can actually live in that vision of what that desired state is. It's very seldom we actually get the chance to see things right through to the end, having to work in nature's time, but we've been very fortunate in being able to see how we've been able to evolve within these processes in order to reach that desired state. Next, please. So with Sandbox, we went through a phase where we were very keen on that middle section when it comes to adaptive management. We read quite a lot about it, we're very involved in it, learn by doing, get your hands dirty, oops, that didn't work, let's move on to something else. But we've also become quite aware that it's not just in the management in itself, but the planning phases as well are quite key. And this is where we need to spend a little bit more time and where we have learned to spend a lot more time. And then from there, moving on to that adaptive evaluation. Are we looking at it as business as usual, or are we looking at it in a way through a different lens of not just the biodiversity in itself, but what does that mean for society? What does that mean from an economic perspective? What does that mean for access? What does that mean for beneficiaries? And what we have to be, sorry, we're still on the other slide. It's okay. What we also have to be conscious of is that what all of this means, as we're evaluating, we're still in a time of change. There's a lot of change happening, not just in the changes in the landscape uses, as we've mentioned, there's changes in economic systems and constructs, if you will. There's all sorts of the changing climates, if we're to generalize it. There's a lot of change that's happening, but we need to be sure that we're still planning for that change, we're managing for it where we can, and that we're evaluating it accordingly. And this is where we start having to look a little bit more towards biodiversity, yes, but what does this mean for people and society as well? So first things first, how do you even begin to achieve a desired state? Some people, such as myself, you like to go outside and have a look at nature and just kind of get yourself in the moment to have a visualization of what it is that you're working with. Some people like to listen to a nice piece of music like we had earlier before the conference started. But everybody has a different way of getting to that point of how do you achieve a desired state. So within Sandbox, we like to make the circle bigger and bring everyone in and have those discussions and then break those groups apart so that we can actually have the voices come out a little bit more clearly about the different perspectives that are coming into to create that desired state. So we start big. How do we fit into that biosphere? How do we fit into the region as a national park, as a protected area? Bring it down a little bit more. Each of these different parks, each of these different regions, each are located or embedded within a different land use. Some places are completely isolated and you're not going to find other neighbors anytime soon. Some are right within an urban hub and others have rural communities living next to them. All very different, that's very specific to that park. And then again, as we were hearing earlier just now, the importance of water. We can't go without it. We need to make sure that we're being responsible with what's happening there. And as sand parks, obviously, we are tourism. However, interestingly enough, not all our parks are tourist destinations. Some of those we just keep as a secret for ourselves to hide in. And then we have our cultural heritage as well. We were just marveling to ourselves how last week was incredibly quiet when it came to heritage. And having listened to a traditional healer speaking about it and the perspective they gave and where we've come from when we speak about our heritage. And these are things that we had to keep in mind as we're thinking about the visioning going forward. And now we take our stakeholders into account, and our stakeholders are broad, hence why we have such a massive engagement first and break it down into smaller teams. Because this can be stakeholders from people who are not even in the park or anywhere near the park to people who are directly affected by the water flowing out, the human-wildlife interactions because something broke out, or any other interactions that may be influenced or experienced. And then right down to beneficiation and access. Sometimes we assume that access means it ends where the gate, where you can enter into the park, but the benefits and the access to it is much more than that. It can be anything from job creation, consumption. We all know the different ways that we can actually be benefiting from the parks. Next, please. So I've been very broad. I'm just going to use 3 very specific parks as an example to give a bit more example of what the different ships actually mean in the context of what we've been working on. So the parks I'm going to speak about are going to be Mokala, Golden Gate, and the Grassland National, well, the soon-to-be proclaimed, it's a work in progress, Grassland National Park. 3 very, very different parks. So if we were to move to the next slide, please. Mokala is a very traditional park. Fences were put up, we bought the land, willing buyer, willing seller, bought the land, done and dusted. We manage 100% what's going on in there. The animals are coming off, one means or the other. Any research that's happening in there, monitoring, Sandparks has their hands on it, and we're monitoring everything. We have that management influence in there. Back in the bad old days, we would have called this a green grab, if you will. But now we've moved forward, and like we were mentioning before, willing seller, willing buyer, so we're in a much better place of how we're actually managing it. But that was how we used to do it. That was how we used to set it up, of making sure we really monitor, control the access and how people are entering the parks. Next, please. Now, Mokala is actually quite fortunate because in that sense, it was in a landscape that was privately owned. So it was much more of a traditional system to follow to be able to get access to that land and to actually purchase it. And in order to figure out, okay, now that we've got this traditional piece of land that we're going to manage as a protected area, we set up what we call our Bible, which is the park management plan. All those engagements we spoke about, all those inputs, context, and all the engagements that need to happen are all put inside there. And this does not take a matter of hours. This is slow. And by the time it comes out, maybe there's a few things that have changed, but at least we've got a plan for the next coming years up ahead of how we're going to do this. Next slide, please. So Mokala, we had to put the fence up, electrify it, make sure that there's rangers walking around. Business as usual. The wildlife in there, protected, making sure that we keep it thriving, moving forward. And when there's too much, we make another plan. Next slide. So with this one, Golden Gate, take everything I just said about Mokala and toss it out. Golden Gate is a completely different park. We have roads passing through there where you do not have to pay for access necessary to get into the park because people realize that, hey, if I step out, nobody's actually watching me. And we have access to the park. So this was initially set up with fencing boundaries and whatnot, but it could not be maintained that way. And because of the history of the landscape and the complexity of the history in our country as well, there are land claimants living there, some legally and some not so much so. Now, when it comes to legally being there, that means that when we are conducting our work in there, we have to keep account that this is people's livelihoods, this is also people's homes, and it can't necessarily be just us putting up our fences, managing, counting, and doing everything like we did traditionally. Now we have to take the land claimants into account who are now actually inhabitants within the park. Next, please. So I like putting up these park management plans to show that we've thought about it, we got the group together, and we actually put a plan together. I wish I had QR codes so that you can go and read all 300 pages of each of these different plans. Next, please. Now, Golden Gate is quite an important one because, as we spoke about earlier, when it comes to water catchments and just the services that the park is providing, we move away from what we saw with Mokala, with the wildlife in itself. Now we're looking at land, and land can be quite a sensitive one. I recall with the Vision 2040, the chairman of the board or chairperson of the board was saying that we are the land and the land is us. So that touches on quite a lot of sensitivities when we start speaking about Golden Gate. I put up these images because, as I mentioned before, when we need to think about some of these complexities, I like to go outside and just look to see what are we talking about here exactly. And what we're talking about are people's homes, people's connections, and we're becoming aware of that. We can't do it like we used to do. We need to think about it differently. what we've seen as well is as we're going around, flying around Golden Gate, I know some of my images always seem like the aerial, that's because that's the happy place. As we're going around Golden Gate, what we observe is that people are interacting with the landscape according to the livelihoods that they know, that they're familiar with. So as we're counting the wildebeest and the eland, you count some goats and sheep here and there. And over the past couple of years, it's been quite interesting and disturbing and triggered a lot of thought of how are we going to do this into the future if the number of livestock is starting to increase versus the wildlife in there, and what exactly are we managing for? The livelihoods of the people in the park, or what Sandparks was established to do? Next slide, please. So we try to find a place where we can actually merge the two worlds together. Over here, what we were doing was actually measuring some of the grasses that they use for thatch. We go out there, we monitor it, we do the usual work that we do, but now we translate it into something that's actually usable for communities and for the neighboring communities as well. So we go out there, we measure the grasses. That is a huge sea of grass there. That was the thatch is created from that disturbance that it gets from the domestic wildlife, so the domestic livestock. So we found a balance of, yes, the livestock is occurring in the park, but how do we benefit for it on a greater scale? So that grass is measured and we let the parks know how much of it can be harvested where. People from the communities then come in and they use that according to what they need for housing, for crafts, for whatever it is that's necessary. People are winning. Next slide, please. And here, you should have seen the first illustration that the pilot had put together for this one. I wish I had put that up. But here it's just showing that we can still combine business as usual. We fly, we count, we make it work. We check how much livestock can actually be sustained in the park and what that means when it comes to our managing the wildlife as well. So this was a great place for us to start learning of working with people inside parks and not keeping people just on the outside. Next slide, please. So everything I just said about Golden Gate, put it aside. We move on to what we're looking at as the Grassland National Park. Now this one is completely different. We're not putting up our own fences. We're negotiating the stewardship and how we work with custodianship and different partners. This is the one context where it's okay to have multiple partners. In this sense, we're able to work with, next slide please. In this sense, we're able to work with a lot of different groups, be it, I've only put a few here, otherwise we'd have rolling credits of all the partners who are working with us on some of these projects. But here, we're actually working on stewardship. If we can have a look at the land to see what's currently occurring on the land, and then have a look at what it is that we're managing for, and see how we can bring those two worlds together, then we don't necessarily have to buy the land, per se. We don't necessarily have to figure out how is this going to work when it comes to land claimants, and does that mean we can't have a national park or protected area here, but rather finding that happy place of how do we now manage this? What are the implications of what we learned from Mokala, for example, of human-wildlife interaction, animals breaking out of parks, or working with water systems and making sure that the catchments are still producing no arsenic and et cetera into the water, but how do we do that with private owners and with communities as well? And given that we have spoken with Vision 2040, the future is mega living landscapes. This is the area we need to start thinking about. How do we now make it work together? Next slide, please. So we're very fortunate that some of these pieces of land that we've been working with in those areas, some of them are absolutely still quite pristine. You can walk through those streams, freezing cold in February still. Walk through those streams, absolutely gorgeous. Yes, they did their assessments, and the indicators say that that water is still quite pristine. And right next door, still within the same landscape, you have cattle moving around. But when you look at the condition of the veld in itself, you look at the condition of what's actually happening in the system, you look at the biodiversity, the orchids, what's occurring there, and you peg it against some of the protected areas, we start to realize that the biodiversity is being conserved. So we can start to think about it differently and applying what we know differently. Yes, we do have to consider how people are going to benefit from this. You can keep your land, but X, Y, and Z, if you take us into consideration as well when it comes to a protected area, but we're starting to win in how we're actually putting this together. And what's great is that in real time, we're starting to learn. We're actually starting to have those difficult conversations. And even if we don't necessarily have the answers, for example, with some of the landowners, they ask us, well, once you guys give us a management plan or start working with us on these management plans, does that mean you're going to be dealing with the caracal and the jackal that come into the park or onto their property? So there's still some nitty-gritties that need to be discussed. And when it comes time to making recommendations for the landowners as well, just being conscious that these are still livelihoods that we're working with, both communal livelihoods, private livelihoods, but we need to just keep that in our minds as we're making the recommendations from what we learned back in the day when we put up our fences and kept it restricted. Next, please. Actually, we can go to the next one again. So we've come to a very interesting place now. We're at a place where we've moved away from basic survival for wildlife survival. That's what we used to call the green grab. We're still in a place of where we're still working with sustainable. And again, I have to be cautious when I use the word sustainable because in some contexts, it's considered a swear word. So we are quite aware of what that means. But resilience and thrivability is where we're headed. We're in resilience. We've been able to hold on to what it is that we're mandated to do within sandparks. Look after the biodiversity, make sure that we restore, bring things back, and that they can function, the systems can function. But we also have to start thinking about thriving, moving on. How do we expand beyond our borders? How do we expand into the landscape? And with this thriving, this thrivability concept is where we have now moved into this mega living landscape of just spilling over into the country in itself and beyond the boundaries that we had created. And what makes this very exciting is that when people ask us the questions of, so how are you going to do that? We don't know, but we're excited that we're going to do it anyway. Next slide, please. And I would just like to say thank you to everyone. I did not put a whole lot of names and affiliates because I mentioned it would be a list of credits if I had to say thank you to everyone, but very much appreciated.